I'd like to welcome everyone also on behalf of the center. We're very pleased to be doing this webinar today with Javier Couso, Constitution Making in Times of Pandemia, Chile's attempt to end neoliberal constitutionalism. As we know, on October 25th, 10 days from now, Chileans will vote in a critical plebiscite. For the first time, the people will decide whether to have a new democratically enacted constitution, which would end the charter imposed by General Pinochet in 1980. Professor Couso will analyze the origins, relevance, and implications, certainly for Chile, but also for Latin America more broadly in this constituent process. And of course, the process includes gender parity as a foundational principle. Javier Couso, we are very pleased to welcome him back to Berkeley, even through a webinar. He received his Ph.D. in Jurisprudence and Social Policy from UC Berkeley. He is now professor of law and director of the Constitutional Law Program at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, and he is a specialist in comparative law as well as the sociology of law, with a focus on constitutional issues in Latin American countries, including Chile, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Peru. I also have to mention he has been an important voice publicly on these issues in Chile, as well as around the world. And he played a central role at the Center for Latin American Studies, beginning when he was a graduate student here and through his distinguished career as an academic and a public intellectual in Chile. Before beginning the event, I'd like to mention that we have people from across the US, from Berkeley, California to Brooklyn, New York, and also people on the webinar from New Jersey, Chicago, Georgia, Florida, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Internationally, of course, we have people in Chile, but also China, Canada, England, Mexico, and Brazil. Our format is we will begin with the presentation by Professor Couso, and then we will have a conversation based on your questions and comments, both those that came in when you registered and those that you may send through the Q&A function during the webinar. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Javier.
Thank you very much, Harley. Thank you very much to the Center for Latin American Studies, and welcome to everybody. It's great to have the time to share with you my observations on what is truly an historical event that's about to happen in our country. On October 25, in just 10 days, Chile stands a very good chance to end the 40-year-long rule of what I have called neoliberal constitutionalism. If the approve to a new constitution prevails in the referendum, and most opinion polls give a 2-to-1 chance of that happening, the constitutional experiment of protecting Chile's notoriously radical version of capitalism would have been ended. So in this presentation, I would like to go to the origins of this historical experiment. Historic, not in the sense of remarkable, but on the sense of having a legacy that we still live with almost a half a century after it was established. So I would start by defining what do I mean by neoliberal constitutionalism, and then go into how it came to be and why it's about to end. I will take 20 to 25 minutes, and then we can have a conversation, because there are many, many questions that I find that people have when it comes to Chile. So as we know, there are many varieties of capitalism. It's very hard to do a different, to organize a different way of assigning, the productive resources of an economy through the market process. But what really made Chile exceptional was that, in a way, it tried to let the market be the main provision, the main source of providing public goods. The motto was private solutions to public problems. If I were to find a motto for Chile's experiment, was not the fact that there was a centrality of the market when it came to production. It was not just that. Deregulation or privatization is what we typically associate with neoliberalism. What made Chile's neoliberalism so peculiar and so extreme was the notion that not even in those areas of livelihood, such as pensions, healthcare, education, the priority was to have a private provider to address those eminently public issues. So in an array of policies, even public transportation, the first pulsion was to have a private provider, making that need being filled. In that sense, one could say that the hostility towards the state was so big that not even public transportation was, in the realm of state-provided service. Even social rights, if that were to exist, were supposed to be provided by private entrepreneurs. And for profit, that's the other element that makes it fascinating. We are using some countries, like the Netherlands, for instance, to have private providers of education for free. And there what you have is the state providing, a private association, state funds, to do what the state cannot do by a number of reasons that can arise. But the notion that you can make money out of serving a public function, being a privately owned company, for-profit privately owned company, took levels in Chile that are really unimaginable. As I was preparing this presentation, I was reminded of a book that a group of economists and political scientists we wrote back in 2013, and we gave a presentation here at Berkeley, and we call it Instead of Privatopia, or the notion that what in Chile what we had was a privatopia, the utopia of the private overall. So that's neoliberalism Chilean style. Let's go to what has to do, and what has the Constitution to do with this very particular understanding of a market economy. For this, we have to go back to 1975. In 1975, Jaime Guzman, one of the most influential, perhaps the most influential legal and constitutional advisor to General Pinochet, was in the midst of elaborating a new constitution. The junta wanted to enact a constitutional revolution. As opposed to many other Latin American military regimes, the notion here was to relaunch Chile. I remember there was this photo, 1810, 1973, an official ceremony of the military junta in Chile. 1810 was the first moment of independence that Chile had, emancipation from the Spanish Empire. So 1973 was being equated to 1810. The notion being that Chile was going to experience a rebirth. And for that, the military regime started only weeks after the coup to create a group of jurists who were keen on the military regime to start studying a new constitution. Jaime Guzman was one of the first 5 members of this group. In 1975, Guzman, who had a very interesting quality, I don't know if it was because he was the main legal mind of a very brutal military regime, but he was extremely candid, and he put in writing a number of things that with insight look very surprising that he would be so candid about. So he wrote in 1975 his diagnosis of Chile's problem before 1973. And he went on record stating the following: all the democratic trajectory of Chile up until 1975 in the 20th century had been one of demagogy, of party rule in the worst sense of that expression, partitocracia in Spanish. And most importantly, it was a regime of irrationality, of public policy that was irrational, captured by demagogy. So that was the diagnosis. The military rule was a window of opportunity to have technocratic rationality provided by the Chicago School of Economics, one of the most prestigious schools at the time, the place where Nobel Prizes were being awarded to economists, the prize where rational technocracy at its most was being produced. The problem, Guzman realized, because he was a very close follower of politics in Spain, he was an enthusiastic supporter of Franco. And even though Franco was no neoconservative in economics, for Guzman, it was devastating to see how no more than a year after Franco had died, everything that had been atado, y bien atado, tightly kept for decades, was unleashed like a magic moment. And this truly devastated Guzman. He realized, as a keen analyst of Chile's history, that Chile had a democratic or democratizing history that made inevitable that Chile will return to democracy, that there was no option. And this was before the third wave of democracy. Guzman knew that it was impossible to put in place in Chile something like the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes of Singapore or countries that have kind of permanent semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian regimes. So he started to think about what can be done. There was time, the chronology, the sequence that was set up contemplated at least a decade to plan the return to democracy in Chile. So he started to think about how to actually prevent irrationality, prevent democracy, which for him equals demagogy, which equals irrationality. So how would you prevent irrationality to dismantle the rational economic model that would be left in place? And then in a very ingenious way, he looked at how the counter-majoritarian institutions of judicial adjudication, judicial declarations of the unconstitutionality of law, which became popular in continental Europe after the Holocaust. Remember, it must be stated that before the Holocaust, continental European academics and politicians were very wary of American-style judicial review of the Constitution because they didn't want the government of the judges, as Lambert put it in 1925 in France, when the Lochner court, that very conservative court that almost made Franklin Delano's Roosevelt New Deal fail, they were, even before the New Deal, in the 20s, the US Supreme Court stand for conservative government of the judges. This dramatically changed after the Holocaust in continental Europe. And it was fair play to have judicial review by a constitutional court, typically, of the constitutionality of legislation in order to protect minorities. That was the big change that in constitutionalism happened in Europe. And Guzman took this new device, this new technique, and put it not to protect minorities, but to protect an economic model that was rational. So that's what I mean by neoliberal constitutionalism. This marriage between a conception of democracy as irrational, this notion that technocratic rationality applied to economics means the peculiar way of understanding the role of the market, not just in the production of goods and services, but in the provision of public services, including public transportation. And the constitutionalist part of neoliberal constitutionalism is the notion, the importation of institutions that were meant to protect the rights, the fundamental rights of minorities, to protect a very particular economic model from the threat of democracy. So that's what I would say was the legacy of the Constitution for Chile since 1980. If we now turn, and I'm very mindful that this is, the start of a conversation, so I would keep it under 25 minutes. What happened once democracy came back, we had, of course, a number of other authoritarian enclaves, as Manuel Antonio Garretón called them, early 1993. So we had some things that were truly undemocratic, like non-elected senators. We had to live with that until 2005. Half of the last 30 years, we lived with a situation in which center-left coalitions will win the elections of the Senate, but would be minority in the Senate. Because a number of institutions that were inherited from the dictatorship would undemocratically appoint senators. In 2005, that authoritarian enclave could no longer be defended, and it was not useful, frankly, because there was enough former presidents of the Concertación and enough of the institutions that were nominating these people who would make this institution not only unpleasant, undefensible, but also useless. So the Constitutional Court became critically important. Of course, the fact that Chile's transition to democracy coincided with the so-called Washington Consensus, the fact that Chile did extremely well in economic growth during the 90s and early 2000s, the fact that there was a lot of poverty reduction, an incredible amount of poverty reduction, made a very interesting phenomenon, made even center-left leaders such as Ricardo Lagos or former President Bachelet I. I call Bachelet I to refer to the first administration to President Bachelet, to not just tolerate the neoliberal model that had been left in place, but to be almost complacent with some key elements of that model. So there was also some ideological transformation, particularly in the policy-making elites that surrounded these leaders. There was some uncomfortableness in Lagos and Bachelet, but the fact of the matter is that the most powerful policymakers of both Lagos and Bachelet I were economists who were coming from the IMF or for the most orthodox neoliberal centers of the economic departments of the United States, typically. So everything was in that kind of equilibrium. The fact that the first non-center left president was elected in 2010 somehow made more intense the feeling of the Chilean model and started to give rise to social movements who had been incipient before, like the high school movement in 2006 that was very critical of the neoliberal structure of the Chile's educational system. But then the university students, college students, went to the streets under Piñera demanding the end of the university laws, the laws that regulated the university system in Chile, particularly the financing of those students, the fact that the banks had a very big, role in financing education that was not of quality and therefore left many people with a very, very, very big, debt and without a workable degree or a degree that really contributed to have a very good, professional performance. So putting this, going fast forward, by Bachelet II, by 2013, the notion that Chile needed to have a new constitution had solidified so strongly that Bachelet included a new constitution in her platform: tax reform, educational reform, and a new constitution. And she got a very strong mandate. She won the 2 houses of government. She won the presidency by a very big margin. But then we knew that for all her efforts, the right wing will never give the 2/3 needed to even start the process of a new constitution. So she did go ahead with the tax reform. She did start it to dismantle an important element of the neoliberal moment, ending for-profit preliminary and high school education. She introduced free college for the half and up to 60% of the lower income Chilean families, but dramatically clashed with the Constitutional Court when she tried to strengthen the powers of unions and when she attempted to provide the national service for the protection of consumers with teeth, with real, regulatory powers. These 2 last initiatives were struck down by the Constitutional Court. So I would say that after Bachelet II, it was even more clear that the Constitution was a constraint on policy making that departed from the model that was inherited by the military regime. In this way, the dream that Guzman had put in writing in another very candid piece. He wrote, the point of the 1980 Constitution is that even if our adversaries were to prevail in presidential or legislative elections, they would be constrained to do something not that different than what we would like to do. Take stock of what that means for the Constitution. In a time when authors like Jürgen Habermas claim that democratically enacted law is perhaps the most likely glue that can put a society that's post-metaphysical, multicultural together. It's, consider a mechanism to force people who are against a military regime, a non-neoliberal, to be forced to do more or less what Jaime Guzman would like us to do is not a particularly appealing way to understand a constitution. It does not provide the glue for a multicultural, post-metaphysical society. So we had a very strong constitutional issue. So, and here I think that it is fascinating to see how history sometimes happens in ways that are very unforeseen. I was rereading this week de Tocqueville's fascinating book on the old regime and the French Revolution. And the first page of that book, the first line is, "For never was any such event, stemming from factors so far back into the past, so inevitable, yet so completely unforeseen." If I were, today is October 15, 2020, if Harley would have invited me to talk at class in October 15, 2019, I would have never foreseen that just 3 days later, Chile's more massive, also most violent social outbreak in half a century would have happened. It was inevitable. We had basically suffocated democracy for 30 years. We returned to something that Carlos Uneus called a semi-sovereign democracy. Of course, it's a much improved system that the only criminal dictatorship Chile has ever had. We had a short dictatorship, but it was not even close to the level of crimes against humanity that we experienced. So I'm not demeritating, I'm not decreasing the relevance of that other referendum of 1988, in October 1988, that ended with torture and disappearance, starting from March 1990. But we had a semi-sovereign democracy. And a number of us were for many years asking ourselves a very simple question that in Latin America is very important. How much inequality is compatible with a democratic system? And of course, in Chile, we had poverty reduction, but equality was another issue. We remain being a very unequal society, a society where the elites have a really first world life, but where millions and millions of people, middle of the road Chileans who walk daily to work, they experience a completely different life, a life where your pension is a function of what you actually make, a life where your pension will be 1/3 of your last salary, exactly at the point when medicines, which are not covered by most social security or healthcare systems, are in most need when you are elderly. So that equation at a time when the middle class has no longer the notion that they have to take care of their parents because they can barely make ends meet. So that was sort of the perfect storm for a social outbreak. We will be discussing for years to come, particularly sociologists, what exactly made that social outbreak of October 18 happen that precise year and date. And we also will be discussing why is that the political system ended up choosing the start of a constituent process as a way to have a political exit to what at times was very serious. There was a moment in November when President Piñera had to choose between ask this time the military to go really rough. The military had already killed 20 people in the first day after the social outbreak, but had he ordered the military again to go to the streets, it would have been hundreds and even thousands of people killed. That's everybody in Chile has that very clear in mind. Instead of that, Piñera let his Minister of Interior at the time, Blumel, and pushed by very interesting new leaders in the democratic right to let the political spectrum get to an agreement. I don't have enough time to go into details, but this was a constituent process that in a way was more model after the South African constituent making body in the process led by Mandela, or perhaps the fact, the one that Gaviria led in 1991 in Colombia. And I would say almost by design, taking a very long distance from the Bolivarian experiences of Chavez in 1999, Correa in 2008, and to some extent, Evo Morales' constituent process of 2009. I would leave it at that. I didn't have a lot of time to talk on how the pandemia has really made more obstacles, has put obstacles on the road. But I would say that I would finish with this. What is remarkable from March to today, we met in March to talk about the imminent constituent process of Chile here at Berkeley, or there at Berkeley. And the fact is that one of the concerns was if this pandemia, which is something that has never happened before in this way, and in terms of the degree of following, how the media follows the statistics, how we look around the world in search of what works, what doesn't. What's remarkable is that Chile has experienced the worst economic crisis in over 2 generations. We have lost thousands of lives in Chile. At some point, we had a worldwide record if you take into account inhabitants. And what's remarkable is that if opinion polls are not crazy, the approve has remained constant, 2-1 on average. So I will end it here. Thanks again for this opportunity to report from the ground what's happening in Chile when we are just 2 days from this referendum that I think would be historical if the approve prevails. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of very compelling ideas and analysis. It strikes me listening to you, we obviously are talking about a historic constituent process, what this new constitution would mean, but we really are talking about the lives on a day-to-day basis of the vast majority of Chileans, what they have endured, how deeply problematic that has been, and now seeking to address it in the wake of these popular movements that you also referred to. I have to say, towards the end of your talk, you introduced three concepts that really, I think, resonated. One, that what happened in Chile, the Constitution, the Pinochet Constitution, suffocated democracy. That notion that it wasn't a neutral observer or limited certain democratic processes. You pointed out it had suffocated democracy. And then a moment later, you said what it had produced is a semi-sovereign democracy, again, with that emphasis on semi and the enormous limits. And finally, you mentioned whether inequality, extreme inequality, is compatible with democratic systems. Of course, this is an issue that is not unfamiliar to the United States on the eve of an election, and with hyper inequality having emerged over the last several decades. So with that, I think it puts a lot of issues on the table. And I'd like to begin with a question related to this from, excuse me, Danielle in Berkeley. How can a new constitution close the huge inequality gaps, both in monetary and opportunity terms that prevail in Chile?
Thank you, Daniel, for that question, because it's one of the most common issues at debate right now. There is a very lively debate in Chile, because as opposed to as what people would think, in times of pandemia, one of the naysayers were saying, how could we possibly have a debate if we are going to be in some places with quarantines, all these difficulties to go into the streets. What's fascinating is that there has been more deliberation, perhaps not many signs in the streets or demonstrations, but deliberations really taking seriously what other people are thinking. And one of the very important issues has been this. People who are for the reject say, the Constitution has nothing to do with the real daily life of Chileans. It would not change anything about it. What I would like to say something that has come up a lot. A new constitution in Chile, and social scientists would get this very fast, is a necessary, but of course not sufficient condition to end inequality. Why is it necessary though? As I was trying to convey, the marriage of one of the most orthodox neoliberal models in the world with a constitution that makes it extremely hard to change that, in the case of Bachelet II, resulted in the almost constant declaration of the inconstitutionality of legislation aiming at ending inequality. She was extremely clear when it came to a bill that was aborted by the Constitutional Court that promoted unions in a country where the best salaries goes to workers that are unionized. You can see a very tangible way in which, if you promote unions, and you protect people who want to create unions, Chile has one of the worst, records on anti-union practices by employers. So when you see places like Denmark, where over 50% of the labor force is unionized, and in Chile is around 10%, through taxation, you can do a lot of redistribution, but it's not enough. You can do that can be hugely complemented by a system where, at the beginning, you do not to redistribute, when at the distribution side, you have, a true collective bargaining. Another example, the Constitution of Chile, as it stands, Article 19, number 16, forbids collective bargaining across in the industry. It only allows it with the company you work with. You know, there is a lot of literature on the benefits and some shortcomings of this particular policy. But in Chile, it's unconstitutional. We don't even get to discuss it. Another example, Chileans were shocked, I'm sure Americans too, when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, got COVID and went to the National Health Service hospital. It was not a political posturing. It was the best, one of the providers for healthcare. In Chile, it would be unconstitutional. Article 19, number 9, provides a fundamental right to provide an HMO or a publicly provided system. So were Chile to try to emulate the National Health Service of the UK, it would be unconstitutional. I'm not saying that I am fully convinced that this is the best way to organize healthcare. I'm just saying that it will be unconstitutional in Chile. And it will not be unconstitutional in the US if you were to go bridge on this particular policy making. So to finish, your very good question. Today in Chile, the Constitution of 1980 stands for a constitution that prevents majority rule, prevents the majority, even if they get a mandate, a popular mandate, to enact public policies that could help. I think that it will help a lot of the Chilean people, but the neoconservatives think that it won't help them, and they have, a silver bullet that it's called the Constitutional Court, that would go and strike down any project. And I cannot even convey to you, I was a constitutional advisor to President Bachelet too, a very proud member, I was not a member of the administration, I was an advisor. But I cannot convey how frustrating it's to try to devise a public policy with the Damocles sword of the Constitutional Court coming out declaring unconstitutional for nonsensical reasons.
You raised a lot of issues in that answer. I wanted to briefly comment on one of them that you pointed out. This isn't the Guzman Constitution of 1980 that's in place, is not in the abstract. It isn't on a clean slate. Is it positive or negative? It is in the midst of a military dictatorship of extreme horror over the prior 7 years, but also that had locked in a neoliberal model of development. And what the court and the Constitution then does is makes it, as designed, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to change important elements with direct economic as well as political consequences. So with that, another question from Berkeley, from Beatriz. You have not mentioned the indigenous people. Would a new constitution change the position of indigenous people in Chile?
Thank you to Beatriz. And I have not mentioned parity. I mean, there is a lot. What happens with this, when you are dismantling a neoliberal constitution, there's so many issues that it would worth have another course, seminar long. Indeed, in Chile, over the last 30 years, since the return of democracy, even if semi-sovereign, President Elwin, the first democratically elected president in 1990, had an approachment to the indigenous communities, particularly the Mapuche one. And that went nowhere. Then President Lagos conveyed a presidential commission. It was about historical truth and a new deal for the indigenous peoples of Chile. It was the first time that an official commission of the Chilean state recognized the fact that in the 19th century, there was something close to a genocide of indigenous peoples, in the South particularly, in the deep South, and also in the Mapuche area. But then again, the report was left, in some place, and nobody did anything with it. And for the first time, I would say, in 30 years, the indigenous rights agenda has been prominent. The conservatives did not want to have, of the 155 members of the Constituent Convention, if it's fully elected, to reserve some of those seats for representatives of the indigenous peoples. Every single party, from the center to the left, was in favor. But because you need 2/3 to change the current constitution, that was not agreed in the agreement to get a new constitution. Neither was possible to get gender parity for the members of the constituent body in the first place. But in November, just weeks before the pandemia changed everything in terms of the way we live life, it was approved as an amendment to the constituent process rules. And we will have it will be the first ever constituent assembly with gender parity in the world's history. So that's a very major, and what that pre-announces is that the text of the new constitution will be heavily gender parity. Because if you have a gender parity body that creates the new constitution, it represents that's part of the normal, of the common sense. Well, my guess is that in ways that are not as strong as gender parity, there is a sense that we cannot continue with the way the Chilean state treats the original peoples, the indigenous peoples of our country, particularly the Mapuche, who have been really the ones that have been, criminalized, called terrorists, and dealt with in ways that are chronically discriminatory. So I'm hopeful.
I would point out that the New York Times on September 20th last month did a major article on the Constitution and indigenous people in Chile. Most of the comments they recorded were a sense of hope, not a guarantee, but a sense that finally there is recognition and the possibility of change. And the article pointed out that in the last census, 2 million people in Chile, 13% of the population identified as indigenous. Let me go for a moment to Philip in Brooklyn. Nicanor Para spoke of deberes humanos. Is there a meaningful way to include human duties as part of a constitution?
That's a wonderful question again, because it's not something circumscribed to Chile's imminent constituent process. The question of whether a constitution, a Bill of Rights particularly, should include duties and not just rights, has always been in the agenda, I think, for a long time. And the received wisdom was that typically legislation imposed duties on people, pay taxes, drafting people, and so on. The notion that a Bill of Rights should include duties has received more cautious acceptance of late, but it's still something people are a bit wary about. And this has to do not with the notion that, of course, as community needs people to, not just have rights, but to have duties and to faithfully and loyally fulfill those duties, particularly pay taxes when you are, when you have the means to do so. But I think that there is more, at least symbolically, I'm pretty sure that dimension of what a constitution should do, at least as stating principles, solidarity, loyalty to the constitution, because this will be the first democratically enacted one in our history. So it will make sense, I think, to say that there's a duty to have loyalty to a democratically enacted constitution.
With that answer in mind, Lovell from Berkeley sends a question. Many people see a new constitution as the solution to their particular demands. How do you design a constitution that gives general structure to a government and rights to those who live within its bounds, but that does not establish so many special mandates as to become rigid and less useful?
This issue came up with the Constitution of Brazil of 1988, which had two problems. It was full of all sorts of special mandates and rights, and then it was very easy to reform. That led to the constant reform of the Constitution by every single administration to came into power, somehow distorting what is the role that a constitution should, ideally play. In Chile's case, I didn't have time in this particular talk to talk about one of the constraints that our rules of the game for enacting the constitution are, which is that you need a 2/3 of the existing members of the constituent body to agree on every single clause that is adopted. This is very demanding. Only South Africa recently had such 2/3 rule. And the South Africans had something that we don't have. They have rules or methods of, ending stalemate. They had that in place. They did not need to use them. That was a good news about that. And basically, they had this rule, stalemate breaking method, which consisted in, if there were two, options and the constituents were not able to get an agreement, they would present that as an option to the people in the referendum that ratifies the new constitution. But they didn't have to do that. So in Chile, there is this 2/3 requirement. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of crude game theory applied to how actors will, operate. The fact of the matter is that it's very hard to apply, crude game theory. Now that the Stanford economists use game theory for, auctions, there are a lot of Chilean analysts who try to anticipate, the fact some people are even imagine a boycott by, let's imagine one group gets 1/3 plus 1 of the Constituent Assembly. You need 2/3 plus 1 to get a new clause. You can imagine a group sitting for 12 months and reading the newspaper and saying no to anything, and they prevail. Politics, constitutional politics, constituent politics doesn't work that way. And there's a number of empirical work on that. So my sense to Jarvis, I guess, assume it is, Laura would be a surprise, it's not him, is that the Constitution, it's likely to have less, it would be fragmented. There will not be a group that in a way gets 66 and plus 1 members of the constituent body. This will not be what Chavez had in 1999 in his Constituent Assembly. So there will be a lot, it will be very hard to get agreements. But in spite of that, I'm very optimistic because there are new generations at play. Even the business community that was historically so close to Pinochet let's say, the people who substituted that elite nowadays states the following. If in 10 days' time, if in October 25, there is a decisive mandate to get a new constitution by the Chilean people, the failure of that process will not end the constitutional problem of Chile. We will end up living with, because the rule says that the current constitution will continue in place. So we will end up with the people who would have spoken, we want a new constitution, the elites who were drafting it would have failed, and then we will be, left with a situation that's not really a very sustainable equilibrium, to talk on economic terms. So my sense is that there will not be as much, special mandates included, because one of the lessons we learned from the neoliberal constitution is that if you want a constitution to last, you would like it to be less committed to a particular ideological economic model, because you would like it to be a place like the US Constitution. Franklin Delano Roosevelt could govern with that, and Ronald Reagan. Fair enough. Same constitution, two different political public policies. And that makes plausible that you can have a pledge of allegiance. I cannot have a pledge of allegiance to the constitution imposed by the only criminal regime we ever had in my country. So that for me, it's I'm not particularly radical for Chilean standards, but you can see the point.
Let me follow this up with the question that brings us into the politics of the moment from James in Berkeley. How can we understand the recent controversy with the comments of the leader of the Communist Party, Guillermo Thier, regarding violence at protests and the calls for condemnation of that violence? What effects might this broader issue have on the plebiscite?
It's a very important question, because it is not just about contingency. This happened this week, and we're talking about things that might shape the country's institutional life for a generation. But it's important to bear in mind that the Chilean Communist Party and part of the Frente Amplio, I would say half of the Frente Amplio, voted against this constituent process. Why did they vote against? They claimed initially that it was not sufficiently sovereign. Why did they say that? Because it has three constraints. The new text cannot be but democratic. We cannot, so I don't have any problem with that constraint. We cannot go China, single party rule by the Communist Party. Happy to do that. Chile should be a democratic republic. There will be a separation of powers, which means an independent judiciary. Okay, that's a constraint on sovereignty. Third constraint, the text cannot go against the international law, particularly international human rights law, which are the ones who are going to be looked at. Third, the Supreme Court would be an arbiter if the majority wants to disregard the rules that I just stated, not the ones I just stated, but the rules of the game of the convention. So a quarter can ask that the Supreme Court, which is Chile, is regarded as independent, not as the Constitutional Court in Chile is regarded as the Lochner Court. The Supreme Court is regarded as a non-partisan court, as an independent judicial body. So what happened with the president of the Communist Party of Chile? There was a very unfortunate incident. We're not yet clear, because the prosecutors are dealing with the issue, where a policeman apparently threw a student from a bridge onto a river. Fortunately, the student is out of risk, and that could have been very disruptive, because the prestige of the Chilean police is extremely low. And they're the ones who have to control riots. So you can imagine when you are rioting and you bring one of the most hated institutions of the country to control it. It's not a very good context. So because we are, in 3 days, we have the anniversary of the social outbreak, of the most violent part of it. The day Chileans will go to vote, October 25th, is the anniversary of the 1.2 million Santiago people who went on the streets on a pacific demonstration. So that's interesting. And of course, when you have the president of the Communist Party, I'm going to be in this very rigorous in saying exactly what he said. He said that he disliked violence, like putting on fire metro stations, subway stations, but these things happened. And when you have a leader saying that you dislike something, but these things happened, and that he was fearful that by calling people to be pacific, that would demobilize people, it was read as if he was condoning the violence. The violence, I must add, only plays in favor of the reject a new constitution. I mean, they were so happy when Tejer stated this. But if I wouldn't, but again, I think that the Communist Party reversed its original reaction to the constituent process. Now it's in full acceptance of the process, and I'm very glad about that. They are for the approved. They're even trying to, they're even open to have a single list to go with the all opposition, to have people to run for, the constituent body. Because if you go, because of the electoral system that would be in place, if you go in many lists, the conservatives would get way more than what the members of the body than what votes they get. So my sense that, and I predict this, very much like happens in the Democratic primary. Like when you're in a Democratic primary, my understanding is that people like Sanders will be very critical of Kamala Harris. But once Biden goes and Kamala Harris is the candidate for vice president, Sanders will be one of the first defenders of Kamala Harris. By the same, using that analogy, in the next 6 months, if the proof prevails, different parties are going to exaggerate the nature of the difference with other parties when it comes to their most preferred constitution, new constitution. But that's inevitable and it's understandable. You want to get more of your own people in the constituent body and you want to differentiate yourself. But once you are there and you need to deal with the real adversaries, the ones of the right-wing parties who are going to go there reluctantly, somehow hoping that this could got derailed, maybe failed, I think that it would be a different movement that's more constructive. And that's my sense of, I mean, it was a bad declaration, the one of the leader of the Chilean Communist Party. I don't think that I would take, that it marks, a very long-term policy by that party.
We have sadly time for 2 more questions. The good news as part of that bad news is that we will be sending the questions that we did not have time to ask to Javier, and he has agreed to answer at least some of them on the blog of the Center for Latin American Studies. You can find that at clas.berkeley.edu. The next question is from Robert. It's a 2-part question. How important do you think the role of Thomas Piketty's guidance was under Bachelet II in trying to institute a genuinely progressive income tax in Chile? And the second part is, do you think the new constitution would be genuinely Habermasian, or did you mean that Guzman's constitutional framework points out what you think of as a weakness in Habermas's own theory?
Can you repeat the first part of the question? Because this is the problem of Zoom. Sometimes you get cut off.
My problem with two-part questions is I often forget the first one. So, how important do you think the role of Thomas Piketty's guidance was under Bachelet II in trying to institute a genuinely progressive income tax in Chile?
Sure, let me start with that. My sense is that it was too recent. At the time, remember, Bachelet's platform was elaborated in 2013. I don't recall exactly the date of the publication of Piketty's first important book, but I don't think it was widely read by I happen to know the policy maker who was behind that tax reform. I think that it provided some, let's say, a feeling of there was a time to do something about it. It was not, closely followed when it came the time to actually draft a tax plan in detail. But it's a question worth exploring further. In terms of the Habermasian understanding, I would distinguish two aspects of it. I think that I would state my own view on Habermas' understanding of, first, constitution making as something different than what role can a legitimate or perceived to be legitimate constitution play in a multicultural post-metaphysical society. I think that Habermas' understanding of how constitution making processes go, it's too idealistic, almost utopian. Even if you study the American drafting of the 1787 Constitution, I think that Gordon Wood and others have done a good work of showing how the anti-federalists were adamantly against the federalists. They were the losing side. There are high stakes. Politics, when the stakes are high, it's sometimes brutal. This is not, the notion that, okay, we're going to, take a break from how tough we treat each other in normal politics. And now we're going to be extremely, we're going to listen to your arguments. Of course, that's, I think, something that has to do with the following. Every single piece of legislation has partisan politics behind, unless it's very relevant. Like what's the direction of a given road if you're, county debate. But with the solemn role that a constitution plays makes people forget how politicized was the. And in Chile, we're going to have very hardcore politics in the constituent process. And in every single country where you're coming out of a civil war or a military coup, sometimes the people who prevail, who won the civil war, are the ones who unilaterally impose the constitution. That happens anyway. The Constitution of Japan was drafted in a US, shape. But somehow the Germans did not want to baptize their Constitution of 1949 a constitution. They called it a fundamental law because it was written under occupation by 4 different countries. So what I'm saying is that the Habermasian understanding or conception of the process of elaborating the Constitution, I don't think it's an aspiration, a regulative ideal, but it's very far away from what actually happens. On the other hand, the notion that having a constitution that's perceived to be legitimate by the bulk of the population being a very plausible glue of society, democratically enacted law, seems to me a very interesting understanding of what role a constitution plays in societies where radically different understandings what a good life means. A very different philosophical perspective, religious perspectives. So I take that part from him and not the other. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very profound question, that one.
And now for our final question from Mara. Following on your response to Danielle's question earlier, do you think constitutional reform is a necessary but not sufficient condition for transforming the relations between indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants and the Chilean state and dominant society? Or does existing statutory law and international conventions already allow for such transformation? If the latter, then what role do you see constitutional reform playing on this front?
It's an excellent point too, because Chile lives a kind of schizophrenic situation when it comes to international human rights law and the way our courts implement those international human rights law. Chile has ratified important international human rights treaties that will be, if they were implemented faithfully and with detail by our court system or our legislation, the situation of the Mapuche people particularly will be much improved. But so I do see there a very important role for the Constitution, the new Constitution. A number of us are pushing for years, we have been pushing for a law that on the implementation of decisions of the Inter-American Human Rights Court. Today, we don't have a law. The Chilean judges, the first things they look at is the law, not even the Constitution. Less so international human rights law. So if we had a very clear mandate by the Constitution that there would be to give the legislation, the legislative powers, a year or two to come up with a law implementing the decisions by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that would be a huge improvement. Of course, I would like the Constitution to be more ambitious to that. The constitutional recognition of the indigenous peoples of Chile, it's mostly symbolic, but then it might have very important, very practical consequences in terms of degrees of self-determinations compatible with human rights, of course, because there are some tensions there with full self-determination, particularly in the justice system of the Native American peoples, and the potential conflict with some due process and some gender equality issues that are being pushed by the women's movement, which I didn't have time to deal with in this talk.
Great. Well, I want to conclude by thanking you, Javier Couso, for being with us for this very thoughtful and informed conversation at such a critical moment. I would point out that you were the last visitor that the Center for Latin American Studies had. On the eve of the pandemic in early March, you taught a course at the Center for Latin American Studies. And I'd like to use this opportunity to invite you back to be our first new visitor once the pandemic ends and travel resumes safely. You can take that as a rain check.
Most happy to go back to my school. I'm a Berkeley graduate, so for me it's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Great, and thank you for this afternoon, and we thank everyone who was a participant in this. We look forward to your comments, and as I mentioned, we will be sending Javier the questions that we were not able to ask because of time constraints. So thanks to everyone.
Good to see you all.